is a challenge. What can we do in order to establish communications that are useful between the Earth and the Moon? We've studied and understand pretty well radio communications that are terrestrial in nature, but you can get a bigger challenge when you increase the distance so much that suddenly you are way out of your own planet. We probably want full access to the internet when we go to the Moon. I would be surprised if that's not part of the requirements. And the good news is, as far as I can tell, that's not entirely impossible. It will have a few challenges. For example, the time it takes for a radio signal to go from the Earth to the Moon is order of a bit over a second. And of course it takes another that much to come back. So that's known as latency, and latency will have an effect in things that require an immediate reaction, right? So when you're having a conversation, I ask you a question, you give me the answer straight away. We have to get used to the fact that I'll ask you a question, there will be a gap of a bit over a second, and then I'm going to get the answer. That affects a little bit the way a conversation is done, but we will get used to that. And the bad news, there's nothing we can do about that. This ground station is something that we put together a few years ago in order to be able to communicate with a variety of orbiting satellites called cubesats. Cubesats are really, really small in size. I mean, most people will compare them to a loaf of bread, maybe something like that could be a cubesat. So these cubesats are normally put on a low Earth orbit, which is order of 400, 500, 600 kilometers altitude. And they have very limited radio equipment, limited power and so on. However, with this ground station here, we are able to point our antenna to as they cross the sky. The computer will follow that trajectory, and the radio system will communicate with them, download any data that is available, or ping them to ensure they're still alive, or check their temperature and their health status. Some of these satellites carry a payload that allows analog voice communications to take place, and occasionally we use that to talk to our friends in New Zealand, for example. As long as the satellite has a footprint that includes both places, that's entirely possible. In reality, the biggest challenge is simply the distance. If you take 2 points on Earth, they're not really that far apart compared to the distance between the Earth and the Moon. So covering that distance, our signal will have to go through what is known as the free space path loss. So the path that needs to be covered will incur a degradation on the amplitude of the signal and the power. And that we can calculate, of course, but that sets the challenge. The distance will result in signals that are very, very low in power, and we have to overcome that by using higher power, better antennas, better modulation techniques, and come up with modulation schemes that will give us a sensible data rate when it comes to digital communications, despite the difficulties. That's where we watch. That's a lot better. Now some signals. If you're out there on the Moon, perhaps, because you have to cover that 300,000–400,000 kilometers of distance, you expect the signals will be very, very low. So you have to use special signal processing techniques in order to get the useful signal out of the noise. This is a beacon, a terrestrial beacon, which is transmitting a digital signal with its identification, which is using certain techniques to allow this beacon to be received when the signal is really, really low and very close to the noise. Now, of course, we can hear it because we're not too far from it. Signals are strong. Most electronics works quite happy in room temperature, but most electronics can get hot. It may work okay to 50 or even 100 degrees. Vacuum does have an effect in electronics. For example, components such as, for example, electrolytic capacitors, that you have an electrolyte inside a can. That electrolyte may want to come out when you put it in vacuum, but We have space simulation vacuum chambers here on campus that allow us to place electronics in vacuum and observe their behavior. It's a challenge, right? You're doing something that no one else has done before, and you can sit down and calculate all you like, but until you put everything together and take into account each and every detail that can affect the quality of the communications you provide, you cannot be 100% certain that it's possible. So we've done the scientific calculations that tell us that it sure is possible to do that, but now we have to sit down and do it. And potentially we'll come up with all sorts of challenges and difficulties we didn't think of. But in reality, such is life for a scientist, right? If we knew everything in advance, it wouldn't be as fun, right? We would just be following a recipe that somebody else wrote.